A reading from the book of Genesis. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God.
This morning I would like to address a subject unlike those we typically tackle on a Sunday morning. Of course, I like to think every Sunday's dedicated to something profoundly important, but today our subject is not only profound, but also vast. Because today we will tackle the existence of God and the creation which flowed from God. And I hope those of you with a scientific bent will find it affirming and challenging, while I hope those of you without a scientific bent will enjoy it as well. And my greater hope is that no matter your bent, scientific or otherwise, you will not find this to be a lullaby which will put you to sleep. So we begin with a poem. "Is anybody there?" asked the traveler, knocking on the moonlight door as his horse in the silence chomped the grasses of the forest ferny floor. And a bird flew out the turret above the traveler's head, and he knocked upon the door again. "Is anybody there?" he said. But no one descended to the traveler, no, not one. No head from the leaf-fringed sill leaned over to see this one who stood perplexed and still, again knocking on the door. "Is anybody there?" he asked, and not a single reply did come, no, not even one. Is anybody there? Is anybody there? Of course, this is one of the long, agonizing questions of the ages, is it not? When people have looked to the heavens and they've wondered, is anybody there? And of course, down through these ages, answers have come back, many different answers. Some have asked the question and come back with a wishful agnosticism. They say they really cannot answer this question of God. Some have asked the question and come back with a bitter atheism. There is no God. While still others have asked the question and come back with an awesome vision of power, but a power that's so remote and so uninterested in creation that this power has simply forgotten us. Is anybody there? Now, I would imagine, if we are honest with ourselves, that there have been times when we have wondered the same thing too. In spite of the hymns of faith that we sing, in spite of the litanies and confessions that we repeat, affirming our belief in God, in spite of the prayers we send to the heavens, there are times when God just doesn't seem to be around, aren't there? I've always loved the story Mark Rayburn tells of the little boy who believed that the sky was simply a big blue tent. And then he went to school and he was taught that the sky was not a big blue tent. When he came home, he reported to his friends, "Sadly, I've learned there's nothing up there." Well, when hearing of this news, one of the little boy's friends tilted his head back. He looked high into the cloud. He looked at the sun that was shining brightly. He looked at the beautiful blue sky that went from one horizon to another, and he said, "Then what is behind the nothing? What is behind the nothing? The thing we can't seem to grasp sometime. The thing we just can't quite see." Here's the good news. The good news is we're not alone in our question. Because you can't read very far into the Bible without getting the idea that others have struggled with this question too. Take, for example, our scripture text for this morning from the first chapter of Genesis. As Walter Brueggemann says, these words of creation from Genesis are among the most important, most familiar, but the most misunderstood when they are read as science, biology, and history. For to read Genesis 1 as an account of how and when and where creation took place always results in this gigantic collision between science and faith. And when that collision happens, theology and religion always lose. You know, it is a shame. It's a shame because this creation story was not always meant to talk about science. It was always meant to talk about theology. This Genesis 1 is a gorgeous affirmation about one who is before anything else. It's about the one who creates a universe with stars and planets and galaxies and vegetation and living creatures and cattle and birds and fish, never meant to be a scientific theory about the beginning of the universe, always meant to be a proclamation, written to express a bold, new, revolutionary theological affirmation for a people who were struggling. Now, of course, in my early Sunday school days, nobody told me that. In my teenage years, when I was wondering, is anybody up there? Nobody told me that. You see, here's what we know. Around the 6th century BC, the nation of Israel has been overrun by the Babylonians, taken into exile. And into exile, they bring with them their foundational stories that for centuries had helped them define themselves and understand their place in God's world. And this exile in Babylon became longer and longer and longer, became more and more difficult. And then these ancient stories began to have more and more significance, so much so that finally all the stories were collected, they were edited, and they were shaped into the form that we have today. So these ancient stories that were edited to proclaim a bold theological agenda, meant now for a people, Israel, who were looking for a reason to keep trusting in God. They're asking as all around them was changing, is there a God? They're asking as anxiety filled their lives, is there a God? They're asking, since the Babylonians are stronger than we are, maybe we are wrong about our God. The God of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac. Maybe Babylon has the true God. And these stories were written to remind these Jews that they belong to God, that creation belongs to God, and that God is still God. You awake? To a hopeless people, these words were written saying, God is the creator, the world belongs to God, and you, men and women, are God's agents. You are given dominion and responsibility over all of this creation, because all of creation is good. Now, can't you see how that would be powerful for a people who are in a foreign land? Don't you see how that could change a person's thoughts about life, who have no hope, who's lost everything that was familiar? For as Brueggemann goes on to say, no one in the 6th century would have ever claimed that creation was good. Oh, please. I mean, for them, life was mean. It was short. Life was full of injustice, suffering, and death. Goodness was somewhere and something else. No one believed that human beings were responsible agents. Are you kidding me? Are we God's partners in the management of creation? Come on. Everybody knew human beings were insignificant. They knew they were unimportant. They knew that they lived and they died at the whims of all of the gods. And then along comes this Genesis story presenting a new and revolutionary thought, claiming the goodness of creation and the God-granted agency of humanity to fulfill God's dreams for the world. Answering the question, is there anybody out there? And it comes back and says, oh yeah. God was and is and will always be. Now, I suppose we humans could have left it at that, allowing the creation story to give us this mystical insight into the character of God, just left it right there. Unfortunately, God made us a curious folk, did God not? And with every gain in human knowledge, it seems we've had to revisit these old assurances of God's character and God's presence with all these new questions. In some way, the rise of modern science has brought the greatest challenge to our theological affirmations and the character and presence of God as we understand them. For example, when I was in high school 100 years or so ago, I was taught about Sir Isaac Newton. Remember Sir Isaac Newton, whose vision of the universe was that it was mechanical, predictable, operating on the basis of mathematical laws? As Professor Barbara Brown Taylor says, in those days, there was no room in the Newtonian universe for randomness, for surprise, for unpredictability, all those characteristics of God. For God was seen as the creator of this great machine called the universe, who simply sat back uninvolved and observed the world's regular, predictable operation. But as I said, we humans are curious creatures. You know what's happened since? Call your grandchildren this afternoon. Call your children this afternoon. You know what they're being taught? They're now being taught quantum physics, chaos theory. It's replaced Newtonian laws, where now instead of thinking of the universe as a machine as we once did, quantum theory is now suggesting that we see the whole universe like a web. A universe that shakes and moves and responds to every single stimulus in it or on it, acting as if it is animated by some intelligence. So, I guess one could say, Professor Taylor says, that thanks to science, not thanks to science for the cell phone, but thanks to science, we are learning that we are living in a universe that's alive. It's a universe that's responsive. It's a universe that's full of energy, full of spirit, full of something. Now, isn't that interesting? Quantum physics and chaos theory, science, has now opened a door to that something that is out there, up there, in here. As if to not only confirm the mystical insights of these first two chapters of Genesis, but also, I think, to confirm that true faith need not be threatened by scientific inquiry, but should welcome and celebrate it for the light it sheds on that mystical something that we people of faith call God. Albert Einstein said it. He said that religion without science is blind, and science without religion is lame. Yes, science and religion, fact and mystery, reality and truth, they coexist in a harmony that perhaps we fail to understand at our own peril. Wake up. Let me tell you what I read this past week. Did you know that on midnight, January 1, 1988, the scientist in Greenwich, England, added 1 second to Greenwich Mean Time? You may ask, why? I'm glad you asked. Because the computer system that they oversaw was so precise and accurate that it was estimated it would take 300 years to be off by so much as 2/5 of a second. And that computer decided it needed to. That computer decided it needed to add a second because the computer had been testing itself against another clock. Listen to this. Against another clock. You know what that clock was? The universe itself. The computer had been tracking the movements of the earth and the moon and the planets and the stars and found that the universe was telling it that it was off and needed to add a second to standard Greenwich Mean Time. Wow. Wagner might wake you up. The start of the football game might wake you up. But I tell you what, that should wake you up. Because you hear what they're saying? The universe is communicating with the computer. In fact, the universe and whoever is behind it communicates incessantly if we choose to hear it that way. I mean, think about the stunning movement and power of the atom. Think about the whirling planets. And if we listen closely, beyond what we can observe and document scientifically, we notice God is also speaking in human lives. I mean, granted, the world may not always credit God's presence behind God's activities, but if we are listening, we will. I mean, isn't God speaking in every deed of compassion? Isn't God speaking in every act of mercy? I mean, isn't God speaking in every court of law where justice and righteousness prevails, in every act of kindness and forgiveness? Isn't God at work when you help your neighbor, when you assure a friend, when you sustain and support a loved one? Isn't God there? We must never forget, John Buchanan says, that when we congratulate ourselves on our own human ingenuity, our advances, our technology, our ability to push back and build up, that there is somebody else here too, that we live in a luminous web which is animated not by us but by God. We really are not the movers and shakers we think we are. For every wonderful human invention, every step of progress, it's really animated and inspired by the one so hard to define and name, distant but close, out there but deep within us, and we best not forget. Fred Craddock. Fred Craddock is a former preaching professor at Candler Seminary. He pastors a little rural church up in North Georgia. He tells the story of one weekend as he was a volunteer chaplain at a small 42-bed hospital in Toccoa, Georgia. Now, Toccoa, Georgia is in the country. This hospital is outside Toccoa, Georgia. You can only imagine where it is. Well, during that week, there was a baby born in this little hospital. And while Craddock was there, he noticed a crowd of people looking through the glass at this very tiny infant because not many babies were born in this little hospital. He asked one of the people about the child's gender and about the child's name, and he was told it was a girl and her name was Elizabeth. Then he found the young father. Father was leaning against a wall. Craddock went over and congratulated him on his new